Story 1. What I am about to share is one of the last memories I still carry from middle school, and not for a good reason. I would say it was the most unsettling thing that has ever happened to me. Back then, I did not have a big circle of friends. The few I had were quirky, but honestly, so was I. We all bonded over the same odd interests and spent a lot of time together. There was Chris, Tom, Mike, and me. We were inseparable back then, like we were going to be friends forever. Looking back, though, it was pretty clear that Tom and I were starting to drift away from Mike and Chris, but that is not really the point here. One summer, Chris invited the three of us on a week-long trip to Maine. His family had a summer house on one of those little islands in Casco Bay. To be honest, we had no idea this place even existed until he brought it up. His family was always kind of private like that. Actually, they were just kind of weird, but that is a whole other story. The drive was long and uncomfortable. I had a stuffy nose and kept sneezing, which seemed to really annoy Chris's dad. He was one of those germ freak types, and every glare he shot me made me feel more and more uneasy. Meanwhile, Mike and I were arguing over something completely stupid, which was pretty normal for us. Eventually, we had to drive the car onto a ferry to get to the island, and I will admit, that part was fun. The house itself was small but charming, and as soon as I stepped inside, I felt a weird sense of detachment, like the place was not quite real. It is hard to explain, but it was like the house belonged to some parallel world. The whole island had this dreamlike vibe. Everyone seemed to know each other, and strangers would wave and say hi to Chris as we biked around. It was kind of surreal. The second day of the trip, I realized my Barcelona snapback cap was missing. I was a huge soccer fan, and it was one of my favorite things. Chris suggested I had left it on the beach, but I was almost certain I brought it back to the house. I remember whining to Chris's dad, who basically told me to suck it up and not ruin the trip over something so small. So, I tried to move on. The next day, after we spent hours biking, I noticed one of my pins was missing. At the time, I had this weird hobby of collecting pins, and losing one was like losing a piece of myself. Jay swore he had seen me holding it earlier, but I just could not find it. I was heartbroken but refused to cry in front of Chris's dad again. I pretended I was not feeling well and went to bed early. That night, I woke up around 3 in the morning and could not fall back asleep. As I lay there, I noticed something odd. There was a faint whispering sound. I froze, straining to hear it clearly. It sounded like it was coming from Tom's bunk, but I could not be sure. I was too scared to say anything or even move. Eventually, I managed to block it out and fall back asleep. The next morning, I tried to shake off the weirdness. We were playing a game in the yard when Tom went inside to use the bathroom. He was taking forever, which was typical for him, but something felt off. I glanced at the house and saw Tom standing at one of the second-floor windows, staring blankly at us. That was strange because Chris's house did not have a bathroom on the second floor. When I turned back for a second look, he was gone. Later, Chris's dad planned to take us to dinner, but I pretended to be sick again and stayed behind. I could not stop thinking about what I saw and heard. Something about it all was just wrong. For some reason, I decided to look through Tom's stuff. What I found left me speechless. My Barcelona cap was stuffed in his bag, along with other things I had not even realized were missing, like my extra toothbrush and, weirdly enough, a pair of my underwear. That was not the worst of it. I found his notebook, and when I opened it, my stomach turned. It was filled with disturbing drawings. Monsters, violent scenes, people being hurt in horrible ways. But what truly terrified me were the drawings of me. One showed me nailed to a cross with my legs missing. The last page was the worst. At the top, my name was written in huge letters, and underneath, for chilling words, "I will do it tomorrow." When everyone came back, I quietly told Chris's dad what I had found. At first, he did not believe me, but when I showed him the notebook, his face turned pale. He told me to put everything back the way I found it. I did not want to, but he insisted. I made a snap decision to tear out one of the pages as proof. Chris's dad then announced we had to cut the trip short because of a family emergency. We packed up quickly and left. The ride home was tense, and I could feel Tom's eyes on me the whole time. Once I got home, I broke down and told my parents everything. They were furious and called the police immediately. The page I had torn out was enough for them to get a warrant. They found the notebook, and all my stuff was returned, except for that pin. Tom and his family moved away, and I never saw him again. Chris and I drifted apart after that, and we never talked about what happened. But last week, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. It said, "I remember everything," and inside was the missing pin from all those years ago. I have no idea how he found me, and to be honest, I am thinking about moving. If anyone has advice, I could really use it right now. Story 2. This story is fresh in my mind since it happened just last week, and honestly, I am still trying to wrap my head around it. My extended family is, let's just say, not your typical crew. To keep it simple, most of them are either obsessed with guns, avid hunters, or both. While other families head to the beach in the summer, ours tends to take vacations in the dead of winter, and not to sunny destinations. Instead, we rent a house somewhere deep in the woods. This year, it was a massive cabin in Vermont. Calling it a cabin feels like a disservice, though. It was more like a mansion, big enough to fit our entire family. Now, here's where things get a little strange. My family has a tradition of playing all kinds of unusual games during these trips, and most of them involve shooting in some way. The strangest one, without a doubt, is what we call the big game. On the second to last night, all the adults bundle up and head out into the woods for an all-out game of laser tag. Yes, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's serious business for us. There is a prize pool for the winner, not to mention a whole year's worth of bragging rights. The equipment we use is no cheap toy either. My Uncle Lucas, the most enthusiastic participant by far, built an industrial-grade laser tag set himself. The rules are straightforward. Every person for themselves, and the last person standing wins. If more than one person is left by midnight, the prize is split. Once tagged, you head back to the fire pit by the house, and the second-to-last person's arrival signals everyone to fire a celebratory round into the air to let the last person know they've won. This year, I was finally old enough to play, having just turned 18. To say I was excited would be an understatement. I could not wait to dive into the game, not even for the money. I just wanted to be part of the fun. Before we began, Uncle Lucas gave us all a rundown on how the equipment worked and emphasized keeping the game fair. Then, without warning, he bolted into the woods like a sprinter at the Olympics. Everyone else scattered in all directions. Most of them headed uphill, so I figured I would go downhill, thinking it might give me an edge. The forest was dark, but the snow covering the ground made it surprisingly easy to see. I ventured deep into the woods until I found a small perch with a good view up the hill. Catching my breath, I thought about my next move. After a while, I decided to walk along the slope, parallel to the hill, to put some distance between myself and the house. It was not until I had been walking for about 15 minutes that I heard it, a faint crunching sound behind me. I froze and ducked behind a tree, straining my ears to pinpoint the source of the noise. When I finally dared to peek, I could just make out faint footprints in the snow, leading to a tree about 15 yards behind me. Someone was hiding there. But what struck me was that they had not taken the opportunity to tag me when I was out in the open. Why? My heart raced as I decided to bolt uphill, hoping to outrun whoever it was. As I ran, I noticed another set of footprints off to the left. These were odd, looping deeper into the woods before doubling back toward me. I could not fathom how anyone could have flanked me that far out. Before I could think too much about it, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone falling into the snow behind me. I took off running again, this time aiming to head back toward the house. When I finally checked my phone, it was already past 11 o'clock. I could not believe how quickly time had passed. Following a fresh set of footprints leading toward the house, I eventually caught sight of my cousin Carl, walking steadily with his laser gun in hand. Seizing the opportunity, I crouched, aimed, and hit his marker. The blinking lights signaled his defeat, and he punched a nearby tree in frustration before continuing toward the house. I was ecstatic, my first kill of the game. High on adrenaline, I decided to set a trap. I sprinted ahead, then doubled back to hide behind a tree, making sure not to leave an obvious trail. It was foolproof, or so I thought. My marker started blinking suddenly, signaling I had been tagged. Frustrated, I looked in the direction of the beam and saw it coming from where I had just been. But the person holding the laser did not turn it off. They kept it trained on me, almost as if mocking me. Curious and annoyed, I started walking toward the source of the beam. As I got closer, I could only see a pair of hands gripping the laser gun. The rest of the person's body was hidden behind a tree. Just then, I heard a series of gunshots behind me, the signal that the game was over. But something felt off. If the game had ended, who had tagged me? Before I could process it, the person stepped out from behind the tree. My stomach dropped. It was not anyone from my family. Worse, there were two of them, both strangers. Panic set in as I heard a crunching sound behind me. Spinning around, I saw a man in a ski mask holding a trash bag in one hand and a knife in the other. He locked eyes with me and started sprinting. I ran as fast as I could, ditching my gear and screaming at the top of my lungs. I could hear all three of them chasing me, shouting words I could not even understand. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were about to give out, but the sight of the house's lights kept me going. Just as I reached the clearing, I saw Uncle Lucas running toward me with his hunting rifle. He fired 3 shots into the air, and the strangers skidded to a halt before retreating into the woods. I collapsed in the snow, completely spent. The next morning, my aunt realized she had dropped her laser gun during the game, explaining how the strangers got their hands on one. The family contacted the police and the property owners, but no trace of the men was ever found. The whole experience left us all shaken. The story took an even stranger turn the following morning. I woke up to shouting from downstairs. Uncle Lucas was outside, yelling into the woods. When I went to see what was going on, I found him staring at a snowman that had appeared overnight, positioned to face the house. In its hand was the missing laser gun. Lucas fired several rounds into the snowman before storming back inside, cursing under his breath. It has been a week since this happened, and I still cannot shake the unease. If anything else happens, I will update you. Story 3. #### Spring Break in the Woods. When I was in college, I couldn't afford the extravagant spring break trips to Mexico that many of the Greek life students went on. As a result, I spent my first 3 spring breaks on campus. I didn't mind too much, but by my senior year, I felt like it was my last chance to experience a real spring break getaway. Mexico was still out of the question since I had to pay for everything myself, but my girlfriend, Ally, found a reasonably priced Airbnb that sounded perfect. We decided to make it a couple's trip and invited Ally's best friend, Leah, and her boyfriend, Calvin. None of us had vacationed together before, so we were all excited. The place we chose wasn't your typical spring break destination. It was a secluded cabin in a woodsy area of Lake County, California. The listing highlighted features like a hot tub, an exposed fireplace, an antique record player, and stargazing chairs outside. It sounded cozy and unique, a perfect escape. The drive was about 2.5 hours. Calvin's cramped Mini Cooper made the journey a little uncomfortable for the girls, who had to squeeze into the back seat. Calvin, who was quite insecure about his car, didn't take jokes about it well, which became an amusing detail of the trip. Despite the tight space, the car's convertible top allowed us to enjoy the fresh air and scenic drive. We arrived at the cabin around 8 p.m. By then, it was completely dark, and the place had an eerie vibe. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees. Only one neighboring house was visible through the thick forest. Despite the spooky setting, we settled in for the night, enjoying the warmth of the fireplace with a bottle of wine and some board games. We planned to use the hot tub, but Calvin was unusually pouty, so we decided to skip it. The next evening was much livelier. After some convincing, Calvin agreed to join us in the hot tub for drinking games. The hot tub was in its own screened room attached to the back of the cabin, which provided a sense of privacy while letting us hear the sounds of the forest. We played Never Have I Ever, with music blasting, enjoying ourselves immensely. But just as the fun peaked, a sudden flash of bright light illuminated the spa room. It was so intense that it could have been mistaken for lightning if it had been raining. We immediately turned the music off and exchanged nervous glances. I decided to investigate, so I cautiously stepped out onto the back deck. The woods were pitch black, and I couldn't see much. Suddenly, I heard a strange clicking sound coming from the trees. Then another click, this time from a different direction, followed by a faint whistling. The sounds continued, echoing from all around us. My heart pounded as I yelled for everyone to get inside. We huddled in the living room, unsure of what to do. At first, I thought it might be a prank, but then someone started banging on the front door. Ally and Liao were panicked, and I told Calvin to call the police while I grabbed the biggest knife I could find in the kitchen. In a deep voice, I bluffed that I had a gun and yelled at whoever was outside to leave. The banging stopped, but the tension was unbearable. Minutes passed in silence before a large rock came crashing through one of the living room windows. The girls screamed as I noticed a piece of paper taped to the rock. Scribbled on it in black ink were the words, "Go away. You shouldn't be here." We scrambled upstairs and locked ourselves in a bedroom while waiting for the police. I stayed downstairs briefly, bracing myself for the worst. Miraculously, no one entered the cabin. Eventually, I approached the shattered window to see if the intruder was still outside, but there was nothing but darkness. The police arrived shortly after and conducted a thorough search of the property. Unsurprisingly, they found nothing. We weren't willing to stay another night, though. We packed our things and left that very night. The Airbnb host refunded our stay but refused to address what had happened. My girlfriend suspects the owner knew something about the area that they weren't sharing. It might explain why the place was so cheap. Even now, the whole experience gives me chills. I don't think I'll be using Airbnb or booking cabins in the woods anytime soon.